Our story begins on a sunny afternoon in a quiet park, where a young girl was sitting alone, savouring her sugar candy. The sweetness of the candy seemed to fill her senses, the world around her fading into a blur. She was lost in her own little universe, the universe that was as sweet and delightful as her candy. The park was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the noise of the world and revel in her solitude. The rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the gentle breeze whispering through the trees were her companions. The tranquility of the park was a stark contrast to the chaos of the city, and she revelled in its peace. In the midst of this serene setting, a stranger approached. His steps were hesitant, his eyes darting around nervously. He extended his hand, asking for a piece of her candy. The request, though simple, was an intrusion into her solitude. She was taken aback by the sudden interruption, the peaceful ambience of the park, disrupted by the stranger's presence. Politely but firmly, she refused. She turned away from him, shielding her candy, her sanctuary violated by the stranger's request. The stranger's face fell, disappointment etching into his features. He muttered something under his breath, a string of words that were barely audible, but carried a hint of bitterness. The stranger left, his footsteps echoing in the silent park, leaving behind a trail of unease. His departure was as sudden as his arrival, but it left a lasting impact. The park, once her haven of tranquility, now seemed tainted, the peacefulness replaced with a sense of discomfort. The stranger's departure left a chill in the air, and the park didn't seem as peaceful anymore. The sweetness of the candy didn't taste the same, and the chirping birds and rustling leaves seemed to echo the stranger's disappointment. The young girl sat there, her solitude disrupted, her sanctuary violated, and the sweet afternoon turning bitter. As the afternoon sun began to set, a strange coldness descended upon the park. The once warm and inviting space was now a chilling, inhospitable landscape. The girl, still nestled on the park bench, felt the biting wind against her cheeks. She pulled her jacket tighter, but the cold was insidious, creeping into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably. Suddenly, the park, once filled with the soft rustling of leaves and distant laughter, fell eerily silent. The wind started howling like a wounded animal. The trees convulsed as if possessed, and an opaque fog rolled in, swallowing the park whole. The girl looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. Her candy-frosted fingers clenched tightly around the park bench. Then the whispers started. They were soft at first, like the fluttering of moth wings against a window pane. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. A voice, unmistakably the stranger's, echoed around her. It was a chant, a litany of curses, each word like a dagger aimed at her heart. "Selfish child," it hissed, "your refusal to share will be your undoing." Cold sweat trickled down her spine. She tried to stand, to run, but her legs would not obey. It was as if the ground had turned to quicksand, holding her captive. She was trapped, a prisoner, in this surreal, terrifying world that the park had become. Around her the world twisted and contorted. The trees gnarled into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The once vibrant flowers wilted, their petals falling like tears. The sky turned a sickly green, casting an unholy glow over the park. The whispers grew louder, the stranger's curse reverberating through the air. The girl's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice was a mere whisper in the wind. Paralyzed with fear, the girl could only sit and watch as the world around her transformed into a nightmarish landscape. In the midst of her terror, the girl remembered the sugar candy she still held in her hand. Her heart pounded like a drum against her ribs, echoing the dread that filled her to the brim. The park, once a sanctuary of joy, had become a labyrinth of horror. Yet the girl was not defeated. In the throes of her fear, a glimmer of hope sparked within her. She clutched the sugar candy, its sweetness a stark contrast to the bitter terror she felt. With a shaky breath, she extended her hand, offering the candy into the void, her voice trembling as she apologized for her earlier refusal to share. As if commanded by an unseen force, the wind ceased its relentless howling. The fog that had once shrouded the park in an eerie blanket began to lift, revealing the familiar landscape. The whispers that had pervaded the air, chilling her to her core, faded into silence. The park was once again a place of peace, the nightmarish ordeal seemingly a distant memory. The girl found herself able to move, her body no longer frozen in fear. She could feel the warmth returning to her fingertips, the cold grip of terror finally releasing her. With a sigh of relief, she left the park, vowing never to return alone. The girl's encounter with the stranger and the haunting in the park left a deep impact on her. It was a chilling experience that reshaped her life, transforming her from a carefree, somewhat selfish child into a thoughtful and generous being. The park, once a place of joy and laughter, had become a stark reminder of a terrifying afternoon that she would never forget, a lesson etched in the recesses of her memory. The sugar candy, the object of her previous desire, was now a symbol of her transformation. Each time she saw one, she was reminded of that fateful day, the stranger's haunting words, and the terror that followed. But it was not a memory she shied away from. Instead, she embraced it, using it as a constant reminder of the lesson she had learned. She became the girl who would always share her belongings, her time, and her kindness. She was no longer the girl in the park, clinging to her sugar candy. She had evolved, learned from her experience. She understood the importance of generosity and empathy, of sharing and caring. This terrifying encounter had taught her more than any book or lecture ever could. It was a harsh lesson, but one that she needed, one that changed her for the better. And so our story ends with a lesson learned. Next time you refuse to share, remember the girl and her terrifying encounter in the park.